We're in the third week of a message series entitled Worship 101, and that's really kind of what it is. It's some basic ideas about worship. In the first week, we looked at the foundations for worship, and those were that were created primarily to worship and honor God. That's our primary purpose. And also we saw that there are some prerequisites for worship, which include that you need to be a born-again believer who possesses deep humility and a sincere love and devotion to God, and then also that you have to have a healthy spiritual balance in your life between knowledge about God, commitment to God, and the worship of God. They've got to be in that equilateral triangle with all three sides being kind of even. Then last week we looked at who we worship, and I tried to explain to you how we need to grow in our understanding of the majesty and the supreme nature of God. We need to understand that fully and completely. Second, we need to see Jesus not merely as the suffering servant, but also as the conquering king that is going to return. And then third, we have to come to know the true character and the nature of God that's contained in all the various names of Him scattered throughout the Bible. One God, many names. Today I want to kind of continue looking at this thing that we call worship and focus on the role of the individual in worship, the role that you have and I have and everybody has when they enter into a sanctuary or a time of worship. And the message today I'm just calling the heart of worship, because that's really what it's about. It starts in the individual believer's heart. There's three things that I think we have to embrace in order to experience real worship. And by real worship, I mean that kind of worship where you know you've been in touch with God and in communion with Him when you leave. You feel different when you leave than when you came in the door. That's what worship ought to do for you. The first thing I want you to understand is true worship begins in your heart, in the heart of the worshiper. And by that I mean worship requires a relationship, an ongoing relationship, just not some casual acquaintance where once in a while you say hi to each other. Once in a while you get together. It needs to become an intimate fellowship or a close communion, a connection between two hearts. And the two hearts I'm talking about are your heart and God's heart. It's got to start there. Think back for a minute to the time when you first fell in love with someone. Maybe it was your first real crush in high school, where your heart just went pitter-patter every time you saw her or him. Maybe it was the one who later became your spouse, that you just couldn't imagine living your life without. Maybe it was when your first child was born and you saw them for the very first time. Any of those examples and more give you an idea of what we're talking about. You had a hunger and a longing to be with them, to spend time together with them, to love them with everything that you had, and to work at and nurture that relationship. Well, that's the same thing that we need to do with God and our relationship with Him. We've got to feed the fire. We've got to work at that relationship and do our side, because He's going to do His side. But maybe you don't feel like that's really where you are with God. Maybe you're feeling there's a little something missing, where you're not quite getting that connection, that excitement, and that rebirth and rejuvenation that you ought to feel in worship. I'll be honest with you, I've been in worship services here and in other churches where I just felt flat and deflated and really didn't feel like I had experienced worship that day. Maybe you're there where you don't feel His constant love, His presence all the time. Maybe you're not experiencing His power working in your life. Maybe you just don't feel the peace and the joy that His Word promises to His followers and members of His family. Maybe you can't quite grasp onto that contentment that Paul said he had in all circumstances or all situations. Maybe instead you're feeling frustrated or like something's missing. And so you come to worship here in this sanctuary and you leave feeling pretty much the same as when you walked in. If that's the case, then there is a problem. And it may not be the songs that we sing. It may not be who's preaching or the style of preaching. It may be with your life because you're not coming in prepared to worship. I'm not trying to be hard on you. What I'm saying to you, I'm saying to me. If that's the case, though, then we're not worshiping as God intends. Well, I've got some good news and I've got some bad news for you. The good news is this: God is already willing, ready, and able to make the relationship work. He hasn't moved. He hasn't changed. He still loves you as much as He did when He sent Jesus to the cross. He's ready to let you experience true worship and be rejuvenated and filled back up. He's ready to let you be His best friend, the foremost love in your life. And He already loves you more than you can possibly imagine. More than a spouse, more than a boyfriend or girlfriend, more than a child or a parent. He loves you more than all of those. Your Bible should say the same thing that I have in mind in John 3:16. For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him would not perish, but have everlasting life. Let me personalize that for you so that it really sinks in. For God so loved you that He gave His only Son, so that you could believe in Him and not perish, but have everlasting life. That's really true. I really believe if God could only find one person in this world to love Him besides His Son, He still would have made the same sacrifice. That ought to be significant in your mind and heart. It ought to kind of cut you to the core to realize the cost that God had to pay for you. The bad news is, if you're not experiencing the kind of worship I'm trying to get across to you, then you're going to have to work at making some changes in your life and in your understanding of what worship is all about. Sometimes you can define something by what it's not, or at least it helps you get an essence of what it is. Let me tell you what worship isn't. Worship is not coming to church on Sunday mornings and singing a few songs and shaking a few hands and suffering through the sermon or sleeping through the sermon, depending on your persuasion, dropping a couple of quarters in the offering plate as it whizzes by you. That's just some of the ingredients or some of the ways we attempt to bring you into worship. But it doesn't guarantee that worship's going to happen. You can literally sit there and go through all the motions and do all the things that you think is supposed to be involved in a worship service and feel absolutely nothing. I've seen people that are not Christians go to a service seeking God and go through all the motions, but they still haven't connected with Him. And unfortunately, I think that's sometimes what we do even as believers. Worship is far more than that, and it starts long before you enter these doors. It's really a lifestyle that you live out 24/7. And it's a relationship that you've got to work at and cultivate and grow into a full-blown love affair with God. A God who deeply loves you and desperately wants you to love Him back. I don't know if you think of God that way, but He really wants nothing more than you to return the love He pours out on you. That's His deepest, most heartfelt desire. Matthew 22, verse 37, describes the relationship we should have with God in what we call today the Great Commandment, where Jesus said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." What He was trying to say is you've got to give Him everything you've got. You can't hold anything back. The real question then becomes, how do you get there? Well, let me suggest a couple of practical things, very practical things that you can do in your life. They're not hard to do, that can help you grow in that relationship so that you can truly experience worship with God. The first one is, true worship requires us to grow in our knowledge of God. Now, some of you are probably going, ugh, that sounds a lot like schoolwork or studying. That sounds like it requires some effort. Well, guess what? It does. I want you to think back to the person that you are closest to in life. Maybe it's a spouse. Maybe it's your best friend. I don't know. You know. Think back to the person that you care the absolute most about, and you know they feel the same way about you. Whoever that is. Isn't that relationship strong, almost unbreakable? You can't really imagine anything getting in the way. Now ask yourself this. How did you get to that point with that other person? What made the bonds so strong between the two of you? I'll just bet you it's probably because you know each other so well, so intimately, that you know what each other's thoughts are most of the time. You can find yourself finishing each other's sentences. And you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you can count on that person no matter what happens. Now ask yourself this, did that happen by accident? Did you just wake up one day and suddenly they were your best friend and you didn't even know how that happened? Probably not. Chances are it took some time and it took some work, some investment, some effort on your part and on their part. And along the way, there were probably some ups and some downs. That's the way most marriages work, don't they? You have a lot of ups, but sometimes you have a lot of downs. But the bottom line is you have to get to know each other inside and out for that relationship to really get to that level. And your relationship with God is really no different. The Bible says God knew you before He formed you in your mother's womb. It says He had plans for you before you were born. And He knows your innermost thoughts. Those are some scriptures scattered throughout His Word. And you've got to reciprocate and do the same thing back. That's not quite as easy for us. We don't have the divine power and knowledge that God has. It takes some effort on our part. It takes time. You have to get to really know who God is and what He's all about and what He desires, what He doesn't desire. How do you do that? How do you get to that point where you know Him like He knows you? Well, remember that triangle I used in the first week with the 3 sides, and on the bottom was worship or passion? And I think it was on the left side of your triangle was the word covenant, which is the same as commitment. And then the right side was knowledge. You've got to grow in your knowledge of who God is and what He has done and what He's still doing and how much He loves you and wants to bless you. You've got to really get that inside your heart and your mind. You have to understand what His ways are and what His will is for your life. And you do all of that by reading and studying and digging into His Word. That's where He has revealed Himself to you. We don't have Jesus walking around amidst us like they did 2,000 years ago. We can't watch the living example in front of us. We can only read about those times and the times before that in the Old Testament. We've got to get in there and dig and read and study and meditate to figure out who God really is. And I promise you, the more you do it, the more you're going to realize the depth and the breadth of His love and His loyalty to you and His compassion and His grace and His mercy for you. And it's going to fill you up until you can't do anything but love Him back. In His Word, in fact, God commanded His people to get to know Him and to learn about His will and His ways and to be obedient to His commands. In Deuteronomy 11, this is just one example, starting in verse 18. God said, "Fix these words of mine in your hearts and minds. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Teach them to your children, talking about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up." Do you get the idea He's getting at there? Make His Word become part of your life until it becomes part of who you are. That's what He's talking about. Getting to know Him so well that you become God-like and Christ-like. If you get to that point, you won't have any trouble worshiping Him and loving Him and serving Him, because you'll be just like Christ. It's through knowledge that we really begin to discover who God really is. It's through knowledge that we learn who it is that we worship and how we are to worship. And it's through knowledge that we learn the true meaning of words like service and sacrifice and love and forgiveness and grace and mercy. They're not part of who we are naturally. We have to absorb those things and learn how to become those things. The good news is God has revealed Himself to us. It's all out there for us to grasp. But we have to make the effort to get to know Him if we're going to have that meaningful relationship that we desperately need to fill up our souls so that we can worship Him in spirit and truth. The third point I want to get across to you today is that true worship requires a lifestyle of prayer. Now, did you catch that? A lifestyle of prayer. Not 5 or 10 minutes whenever the mood hits you, or 2 minutes right before you enter into the sanctuary, or a minute right before you have your meal. That's not a lifestyle. That's kind of a haphazard habit. I'm talking about something deeper in that. The goal for every one of us should be to connect with the presence of God and maintain constant communion with Him throughout the day and throughout the week. That's what Paul was talking about when he wrote in Colossians chapter 4, verse 2, devote yourselves to prayer, keeping alert in it with an attitude of thanksgiving. Did you catch that first word, devote? When you're devoted to something, your spouse, or you're devoted to football, or you're devoted to your career, that means it's an all-consuming passion. It never wavers. Jesus tried to get His disciples to do that when He was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. Remember that picture in your mind where He's kneeling down and praying, and He's praying so fervently that He's dripping sweat mixed with blood? There's a medical term for that. It can actually happen. I forget the term right now. He was trying to get His disciples to pray while He was praying. He was trying to get themselves to devote themselves to prayer and keep alert in it. But what did they do? They fell asleep. They missed the opportunity to learn from His example. And they missed the opportunity to really commune with God the Father like He was. And then after His arrest, because they hadn't been praying, and He was talking to them about avoiding temptation, because they had not been praying, as He said, then when He was crucified and hung on the cross, they panicked and they scattered. They ran away. And poor Peter, he even went so far as to deny Jesus, not once, not twice, but 3 times. The world got between them and God. And it scared them to death and robbed them of the confidence that they had in Jesus. The confidence that had been building for 3 years shattered in an instant. The bottom line is, if we're going to really worship God and maintain communion with Him, then we have to learn how to become prayer warriors. I can look around the room here today and see some people that are, because I know that they are. I've talked with them and I've seen them pray and heard them pray, and I've heard them tell me how that's part of their daily life. The bottom line is, you can't sleep through the week like Jesus called it. You can't go to sleep and not pray and then run to church on Sunday and just somehow imagine that you're going to feel the presence and the power of God. You haven't done anything to prepare for that. That relationship has to be firmly established and maintained, or the worship service will leave you feeling empty and all alone and unchanged because you're just going through the motions. Imagine a farmer getting up one morning and saying, I think I'll go see how my crops are doing. And he walks outside and there's nothing there because he hasn't plowed the ground and he hasn't planted the seed and he hasn't cultivated and watered it. Well, you're not going to get a crop. I'm sorry. It's not going to happen. You might get a crop that you don't want, like weeds and thorns and thistles, but nobody's willing to give you anything for that. Or imagine that you want to go run a marathon. By the way, those are not as much fun as they look like. I ran 4 of them, and I don't think I ever want to run one again. But some people think they're going to go and run a marathon and just step out there with no training, no preparation, and they'll just eat a lot of pancakes the morning of the marathon. That'll give them energy, and they can go run 26.2 miles. I've seen people who are that stupid. And usually by about the 4th or 5th mile, they're down on their hands and knees, and they're wondering what in the world possessed them to think they could run that distance. Anything you want to do is going to take some preparation and some commitment and some effort on your part. And worship is the same as anything else. If you don't put it in up front, you're not going to get it out in back. It's not going to happen. And so we sit out in the sanctuaries and we say, well, they didn't sing the songs I wanted. That's why I don't feel uplifted. Or I don't like that preacher. He's just too stuffy, or he's just too analytical, or he tells too many stories, or whatever you want to blame it on. Or I don't think the sermon was long enough, or most of you are saying, I don't think the sermon was short enough. You know, you can find any reason at all why you didn't worship. But you know what? I've been in churches that were extremely formal, like Episcopal and Presbyterian churches that were very liturgical. And I've been in services where I thought, oh, Lord, what have I gotten into? Where people were jumping out in the aisles and dancing and clapping and, just going crazy. Guess what? I was able to worship in both of those, even though they're at the opposite ends of the spectrum. And I've talked to missionaries that have gone to foreign countries in Africa and Asia and South America that said some of the best worship they've ever experienced was in a culture that was completely and utterly foreign to everything they ever knew about worship. It's not the style, it's not the music, it's not the preaching. It starts in your heart. And if you don't get that straightened out and have that already prepared and primed when you come in here, then you might as well not come. I mean, I know that sounds harsh and blunt, but it's true. Because you're just here then to go through the motions and let everybody see that you were here and that you did your part and you were obedient and dutiful and you went to church. You get 100% on attendance. But it's not going to get you where you need to be. The reason I'm doing this series is I'm trying to get us refocused back on what worship is all about, and so that you can begin to refocus on that and begin to experience real worship. And you know what? It's not about Chris and Katie. It's not about Carla. It's not going to be about Billy or whoever else is up here. You've got to come ready to seek God. He's already seeking you. You've got to do your side of the equation. Let me explain to you for just a couple minutes why prayer is so important if you want to have effective worship. The first reason is prayer is the way that we bring honor to God. When you pray, whether it's the Lord's Prayer or something else, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. In other words, we're supposed to be acknowledging just how awesome God is. It's where you recognize the supreme place that He has in this created order. Recognize Him as creator, sustainer, provider, healer. Where you bring honor and glory and praise to His name. Just because of who He is. Not because of what He did for you, but just because of who He is. It's where we also express our humility to Him. Because once we understand who He is, we begin to realize just how puny and insignificant we are. And that's the humility side of it. Understanding where we stand in relation to Him. If you're not humbled by that, you got some work to do. It's the way we pay honor and homage to somebody like we do a dignitary that comes to this country or to the president or a congressman or a senator. Don't we kind of kowtow to them a little bit? Don't we get just a little more humble, and don't we welcome them just a little stronger than just any Joe Blow? It's because we recognize the position that they occupy. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we can do that for human beings, my goodness, why can't we do it for God? The second reason that prayer is so important for worship is it reminds us of our total dependence on Him. And it expresses that dependence back. In other words, we're admitting to Him that we can't do it. That we need Him every second, every minute, every hour, and every day. The old hymn, I need Thee every hour. You could say, I need Thee every second. and that would be closer to the truth. It's the way that we are reminded that we can't do anything without Him that's of lasting value. You can work yourself to death, don't get me wrong, and you can get busy at this church. I've caught myself in this little hamster wheel before. You can get so busy you don't know whether you're coming or going, and yet you're really not accomplishing anything that's going to last. Because you're doing it all in your own power, and you're expecting that somehow that's going to get you on God's team. That's going to make Him love you enough. But you never can get there in your own power. You've got to recognize that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And I can do nothing of any lasting value on my own. You've got to remember that with God, nothing is impossible. But without Him, nothing of lasting value is possible. You got to get that differentiation there to where you become totally dependent on Him for your power, your strength, your wisdom, your knowledge. Third reason that prayer is so vitally important to worship is prayer is the way that God supplies our needs. It's through prayer. Jesus Himself taught His disciples, ask and it will be given. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds. And to him who knocks it will be opened. Boy, He said that 3 ways and then came back and said it 3 ways again. I think He's trying to tell us something. And yet, when we pray, a lot of people, and even a lot of Christians, I think, kind of doubt whether prayer really works or whether it's really that vitally important. And I think I know why. It's because we misunderstand, what real prayer is and how we're supposed to pray. We tend to pray alone or together as if God is some sort of divine Santa Claus. A spigot we can turn on and turn off. Hey, God, I need something. Let me turn on here. Oop, that's cold water. Let me turn on the hot water. I need some hot water. And then we turn Him off. Okay, God, got everything I need. Don't need you anymore. And when we pray like that and then He doesn't answer the way we wanted, we begin to doubt the value and the effectiveness of prayer. But the problem isn't with prayer itself, it's in how we're praying. Now don't get me wrong, it is perfectly okay to ask for things for yourself or for others that you know about, to intercede for them. But you also have to remember that with that, you've got to pray according to God's will. And you've got to be willing to accept that will even when it doesn't match up with yours. That's what Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane. Remember, He was kneeling and praying, and He really wanted this. He said, God, if it's possible, take this cup, the cup of suffering that He was going to have to endure. God, if it's possible, take this cup away from me. That was Jesus' heartfelt desire. He wanted that as bad as anything you've ever wanted in your life. But He followed that up with, but nevertheless, not my will, but thine. What He's saying is, God, I really want this. If there's any other way, let it be the other way. But if it isn't, if that's your will, then let that be done. And I'll accept it. Do you see the difference between saying, God, please heal my husband and my wife? They've got cancer and I don't know if I can take it. Please heal them. And you stop there. Instead of adding, but God, whatever the outcome, whatever your will is. You know my desire, but I submit to your will. Do you see the difference? It's recognizing who's in control and who's not. Whether he grants your request or tells you no. He told the Apostle Paul, who had prayed multiple times to remove some kind of figurative thorn from his flesh. And every time God said, my grace is sufficient. In other words, I'm not going to give you what you're asking for. You're going to have to live with that thorn in your flesh and still worship me and serve me. We don't like that. It goes against our grain. We are self-centered, we are selfish, we are sinful at our core. When somebody tells us no, whether it's your spouse, your child, your best friend, your employer, your employee, or God, we don't really like that. But that's the way it works. We have to learn to pray in line with God's promises. You know, there's a lot of promises in His book. If you will pray those promises aloud verbally, God, you promise me peace, please give me peace. You promise me contentment, give me that contentment. Show me how to reach that. You can pray for His promises. Now, He's going to give them to you as He deems best and in the way He deems best. But you can pray for His promises that are in His Word. And if you pray long enough and diligently enough, He will give those to you. We need to pray for His presence, just to feel that He's there with us. For His protection when we're in danger. For His power when we don't have enough on our own merit to get through whatever we're going through. We need to pray that His will be done in our lives no matter what. That includes no matter how big of a mess we make of our lives. We need to pray for His direction instead of just setting out in our own direction. For His provision. Now notice I didn't say for what we think we need. God says He'll provide our needs. He doesn't guarantee that He'll give you all your wants. Otherwise, we would all win the lottery tonight, wouldn't we? Or tomorrow night, or whenever they pull the next numbers. I mean, let's all be honest. Wouldn't we all like to win that? I think it'd be pretty cool to win $1 million or a multiple thereof. Somehow I don't think that's going to happen, especially when I never buy a lottery ticket. We have to trust that His answer is best, even when we can't understand why things are happening the way they are. Let me give you a real-life example of somebody that prayed this way. Thomas Aquinas, famous in church history, had a simple but very persistent and effective way of praying. Each day, he just prayed like this, that God would reveal Himself and make His will known to him, and that he would feel God's presence as he went through his day. That he would be empowered to do whatever God put in his mind to do, no matter where it took him or what God might call him to do. That was it. He never said, God, can you give me some money? Can you give me a house? Can you give me a car? Can you give me a racehorse? Whatever. He just said, God, I just want to feel you in my life and feel your direction and be empowered to do what you want me to do today. Now that seems kind of simple at first, but when you really stop and think about it, it's total submission to God and to His will. And you're saying, God, I trust you completely, absolutely. Just show me what you want me to do and then give me the strength and the power to do it. Can you imagine how good your life could be if that's all God did, was show you what to do and give you the strength and the power to do it? Man, you would never fail. It'd be rosy all the time. Because every day you would accomplish what you set out to do. There'd never be a disappointment. There'd never be disillusionment. I got to work on that one some, I'll be honest with you. But I'm going to try. Listen to the importance the great Charles Spurgeon in England placed on prayer if you want to experience real, vibrant, living worship. He said, why is it that some people are often in a place of worship and yet they're not holy? And then he answered his own question. It's because they neglect their prayer life. They love the wheat, but they don't grind it. They would have the corn, but they will not go forth into the field to gather it. The fruit hangs on the tree, but they will not pluck it. And the water flows at their feet, but they will not stoop to drink it. The point he was making is that it's all there for the taking. But sometimes we won't do it. We won't prepare. We won't reach out and take hold of what God's offering us. In his book, Elements of Worship, a man named Judson Cornwall explained the direct link between prayer and worship this way. I'm really trying to give you some examples here so that maybe you can latch onto this. He said, prayer cannot be successfully separated from worship, for it prepares the soul for worship. It expresses the Spirit in worship, and it interacts with God, which is worship. Worship without prayer is like daytime without light, like a school without students, like a choir without music, or an automobile without fuel. The praying saint cannot keep from worshiping, while the prayerless saint cannot rise to worship. I'm hoping that some of these examples and quotes are going to get through to you, because we're not all alike. One's going to appeal to one person and another one's going to appeal to somebody else. It's going to ring that bell. Let me try to wrap this up. Experiencing true worship, and by that I mean worship that is vibrant and energizing, the kind of worship where you know that you've been in the presence of God, demands that we strive to grow in our relationship with Him and maintain constant communion with Him. You will not really worship God if you don't do that. We do that by studying and digesting God's Word. We do that through a lifestyle of prayer and by loving God more than anything this world has to offer. But we still have to maintain that healthy balance between worship and knowledge and commitment. You've got to have that equilateral triangle going in your life if you want to experience worship like God intends. If you have just truth, just knowledge, and none of the emotion, none of the passion, you'll have nothing but dead orthodoxy, which is why a lot of churches are dying. They know all about God, they just don't know God. You'll have a church full, or at least half full, of artificial admirers, or what the world would call hypocrites. They got everything they can spew out of their mouth about God, but they truly don't know Him and worship Him. On the other hand, you can have too much emotion, too much of the worship, and not enough knowledge. That's just as bad. Because then it produces that frenzy and that shallow believer mentality where you're just there to raise your hands and dance and sing and shout, but there's nothing behind it. You don't even know who you're worshiping. There's no deep, sound doctrine. There's no strong and abiding commitment to serve the Lord with all your heart. It's just a show you go to once a week to get that high. And a few hours or a couple days later, it's gone. You can't have one without the other. Strong affections for God, rooted in truth and knowledge, and cultivated in commitment, are at the heart of worship. You got to have all three. Judson Cornwall had another good quote, I thought. I'm going to close with this. If worship is love responding to love, in other words, our love responding back to God's love. If worship is love responding to love, and if nothing in heaven, on earth, or in hell can separate us from God's love, then surely nothing can separate us from responding to God's love. And that response is worship. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.